Good morning or afternoon, evening if you're joining from a different time zone. Welcome to this forum put on by Scientific American Custom Media in partnership with Synairgen. Thank you for the support. I think this is going to be a great discussion, a timely one. I'm Jeremy Abbott, publisher of Scientific American, and I have the immense pleasure of conversing with three luminaries in the world of bioscience. Today's talk, discussion, salon, if you will, is titled The Hunt for a Versatile Respiratory Virus Killer. And no, that is not the name of a Tom Clancy novel. It's actually, in some ways, kind of a holy grail for those working in public health. And we're going to explore what I think is a critical part of the arsenal for not just the pandemics of the future, but for viruses in general and for public health. And we've seen so much fast innovation over the last few years. Great innovation, almost to the point where we hope we can feel we can do anything. But there are many challenges in doing anything. A virus is, of course, a formidable foe, working into the cellular mechanisms, mutating. It is hard to eradicate that. We've certainly had some great successes. A pandemic from many years ago with HIV taught us a lot about viruses. We've had a lot of successes in the world of Hep C and other conditions. We are now faced with the future and the prospect of emerging infectious disease and making sure we have a pharmacopoeia, a portfolio that can deal with it. So without further ado, and I'm not going to spend too much time because your biographies are very long, gentlemen. I will, next to me is Dr. Philip Monk, Chief Scientific Officer of Synairgen. Thanks for joining. And next to Phil is Charles Dela Cruz, Associate Professor of Medicine and of Microbial Pathogenesis at Yale School of Medicine. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much.
Last, but certainly not least, Dr. Rick Bright, international expert on pandemic preparedness and response, formerly CEO of the Pandemic Prevention Institute at Rockefeller Foundation, also formerly of BARDA, and worked in the biotech sector in different spheres. So we have, I think, if you guys don't have interesting answers to these questions, no one does. So I'm thrilled. And I'm going to just begin and throw out a kind of an opening statement question, and I will actually edit it as I speak it. Because I first wanted to say, how likely is it that a new SARS virus will be a dangerous threat? But I think we all know it's likely. And we all know there's going to be several respiratory threats in the future. So my question, and I'll start with you, Phil, because you're right here. Mm-hmm. My question is, because that is likely, how important is the role of antivirals in our future portfolio?
Well, I think we've learned a huge amount from the current pandemic, and particularly the period from when the virus first emerged in China. The time it took us to get to a point where we had vaccines and antiviral treatments, there was nothing to fill that void, and we need to make sure that never happens again.
Yeah. Charles, I'm going to ask you the same question, but I'm going to put a little bit of a spin on it. My analogy, and we love analogies in publishing, is after World War II, so many parts of our defense ecosystem rose up because we knew this couldn't happen again. We did not want this to happen again. And I see a similar situation happening, I'll call it post-pandemic. We want to make sure we're prepared. And that means every sector, public, government, private sector investment. Our vigilance is high. And I will reiterate, to what degree is the antiviral part of that portfolio important?
Yeah, it's very important. I like the analogy with the war. In the past, we've learned, and maybe not having fully learned from prior influenza pandemics, which typically happens every 30 years or so. With each of these pandemics, with influenza, for example, we all come together, address it. There's a lot of attention, but that attention sort of wanes and we forget our lessons. And so it's not really surprising that when COVID happened, There's a huge mobilization of really talented people taking care of the patients, researchers developing new tools, industry coming up with new drugs, and then the government jumping in and really helping the efforts. So we really don't want to lose that momentum and sort of not learn our lessons. And we're starting to feel that right now as we're 3 years into this pandemic. People want to go back to their normal life. It doesn't mean that we have to forget what we've learned. I think currently, as we go into this current respiratory viral seasons, we're still facing with COVID-19, with the SARS virus, influenza viruses, RSVs. We have patients in the hospital infected with all of these. For some of these viruses, we have some therapies, but we could do more. For RSV, we have no options for these patients. So I think it's really important to continue the discussion, these collaborations that you're talking about, and continue the momentum and not wait for the next pandemic to really think again.
Not waiting, right? Getting an early start. Something that, Rick, I know you have a lot to say about, being someone who was at the forefront of realizing we were in a pandemic. Maybe some others didn't even realize that. So from your perspective, and I know you are certainly working with a host of diagnostic tools, but in your mind, how does this antiviral part of the portfolio play into our future preparedness?
The antiviral portfolio is absolutely critical to not just future preparedness, but to diseases that we face every day. Every day, somewhere in the world, people are infected and dying with influenza. It's a seasonal. We have a northern hemisphere and a southern hemisphere. We have 500,000 people die every year from influenza infection, seasonal influenza infection. And then we have that ongoing threat of avian influenza that could cause a pandemic. And you're seeing more and more instances of avian influenza in the United States and around the world than we've ever seen in the past. The threat is imminent. And it's important, I think, if I can stick with the analogy you have of war. I mean, this isn't just about health and health security. As we've seen too acutely now with COVID, it's a matter of national security. It's a matter of global security, economic security. I mean, there are so many things impacted by the devastation of a rapidly spreading, emerging pathogen, especially respiratory pathogens that are airborne and can be spread so easily. And it takes too much time to develop pathogen-specific therapeutics and vaccines. And we did it at record speed. That was too much time. These types of tools for their host-directed, agnostic, are going to save millions of lives every year, in addition to those additional lives when we see a crisis such as the pandemic.
Record speed is something we almost take for granted, right? We realize record speed in magnitudes we didn't even know were possible, right? In the vaccine story. But now we're talking about something that is much harder. And let's take a moment to appreciate the significance of the challenge with a virus. Mm-hmm. And I know there are people viewing that might not be scientists, but I'd love to delve into a little bit of why there are so few right now antivirals. What is the challenge? And you think about antibiotics starting in the 1930s in human trials, and I think 1940, they had a great head start. But they also, in terms of infectious diseases, had a simpler job, right? Targeting a cell wall. I feel like we have to appreciate the complexity of a virus and its mutation and its stealth to mm-hmm. carry that war metaphor. Mm-hmm. It's something that commandeers our cells. So Phil, how do we deal with that complexity?
So I think we target the virus in different ways. I think there are different approaches to antiviral development. I think you can look at approaches which target the virus itself. You can look at approaches which are more host-directed, which target either the cellular machinery or the proteins that the viruses use to replicate themselves. Mm-hmm. Or you can look to boost host antiviral response. And these are all valid approaches, and they have different pros and cons.
Yeah. Charles, I mean, would you agree with that complexity and certainly the various approaches? I know some of your research involves these approaches.
Yeah, I mean, for bacteria, most bacteria can replicate outside the host cell. And so it's likely easier to target with antibiotics, targeting the bacteria, causing bactericidal effect, bacteriostatic effect. With viruses, its life relies on being inside your host cell. And what Phil is saying is that these viruses is taking advantage of our own immune cells and cells in our respiratory tract to replicate. And it makes it harder for therapeutics to target that without causing harm with the host.
Yeah.
And so we have to be more clever than the viruses to come up with ways to boost our immune system so that we could fight against these viruses, especially if you're thinking about broad coverages of different respiratory viruses.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Jeremy, can I add a little bit on that too? Because we've also advanced our toolkit, our molecular biology. We can understand these pathways, a lectin pathway for complement activation or cellular activation for cytokines to regulate and modulate cytokine storm. And we didn't have that knowledge in the past, and we didn't know what those different members or processes were in those cascades. So we couldn't target some of these hosts. We didn't understand exactly how interferons were regulated, perhaps, or downregulated, and appreciate the value of an organism such as the virus and its full ability to regulate our host immune response. So now that we're learning more, we have those molecular tools, we can develop therapeutics that can counteract that activity by the virus or counteract our hyperactivation by our host to more carefully modulate that response to both get rid of the pathogen, but also keep yourself from harming yourself.
Right. That's a great point. I want to take one quick public service break here. If you are viewing this from your home or office, you can ask a question. There's an interface on the web platform. I believe you just type a question and ask it, and later in the program, we will be answering some viewer and live questions. Just want to make sure that was clear. I'd love to talk about broad spectrum antivirals. They're obviously much needed. And my question, let's talk about the clinical need here for broad base. I mean, certainly when we think about future pandemics, but also just these, hard, challenging viral threats we will come upon. What is that clinical need?
So I think the clinical need is huge. We know that hundreds of thousands of people in the US alone are hospitalized due to respiratory viruses. We talked as well about the fact that there are many respiratory viruses which can cause severe viral lung illness. It's not just flu or coronavirus. There are many, many other viruses. And one of the problems historically is we really haven't had the tools for testing for those viruses. It's interesting, as a company, we've been running trials as obviously with an antiviral drug. And in a trial that we were running before COVID, we were using technology to swab people to see if they had a virus before we treated them.
Right.
At the time, this was very novel. I'm guessing most people in this room have probably swabbed themselves a few times in the last couple of years. And there's been a step change, and it's been driven by this pandemic. What's happening now is we are testing for viruses more. There are technologies for looking at multiple viruses, and we can now try and gain a better understanding of the pathology associated with these viruses.
Yeah.
It's surprising that this information isn't already out there. These viruses cause hospitalizations every single year in vulnerable populations, and yet we don't really have an understanding of viruses other than flu and RSV, where we've started to develop therapies.
So has this been a wake-up call?
I think this has been a reminder. I think as a population, we've got used to people getting viruses and ending up in hospital and dying. Yeah. We're just taking it as the norm. But now I think we're thinking about this differently, because we're thinking we could treat these patients, we could stop them ending up in hospital, we can stop them dying. And we need to do something about it.
Rick,
and we're also appreciating more the long-term effects of a viral infection. If you don't really knock that out soon, we are just on the cusp of learning as much as we can about long COVID. And I just published a paper this week with colleagues showing the association with COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 infection and sepsis. And so appreciating the cascade of effects of a viral infection into long COVID and what does it mean, and into sepsis and the dysregulation of the entire immune system that can lead to death and lifelong complications is really important. And that, again, goes back to this unmet medical need to detect these early and treat them early to prevent those long-term effects that we're seeing with COVID-19.
Yeah. Charles, are we appreciating the clinical urgency here?
Yeah.
More so?
Exactly. I think there is. And, we've learned in the past that, lung infection, respiratory infection just affects the lung. But we learned from COVID-19, with these respiratory infection, with the systemic inflammation, it can cause more cardiovascular problems, sort of brain issues, right? Patients with more dementias. And these are profound implications for what a small respiratory virus can do. These viruses are lethal, right? And it can affect and impact patients. What's unfortunate is that patients are hospitalized with these respiratory viruses. And for many of them, for many of these viruses, we don't have therapeutics for. All we can do is provide them with conservative management, provide oxygen, put them on ventilators. And we really need therapeutics for these patients. I mean, many of us are fortunate. We can have just these viruses and we can have a cold for a few days. But there are people who are vulnerable, like what Phil says, older people, children, immunocompromised patients, patients with chronic lung disease, heart disease, diabetes. These are a lot of patients that have susceptibility, could have severe disease outcomes.
And would you say, I was going to say, the attention to vulnerable populations seems to be some of the, one of the good things that's perhaps come out of the crucible we've been through. Would you agree with that as well?
I would do. And I think the company that I work for, the founders of the company have always been interested in the impact on respiratory viruses on patients with lung disease.
Sure.
And in their research, they want to understand why these patients are more vulnerable to respiratory virus infections. And so they took cells from the lungs of patients with asthma and COPD, and then they found that those cells were more susceptible to virus infection. And then that led to an understanding of mechanism and the inhaled interferon beta program. But I think we are gaining a better understanding now of which populations are vulnerable and which patients can benefit from treatments that boost host antiviral response. I mean, the elderly are another group which also have a deficient immune response because of an aging immune system.
Right. One of the things that's certainly come out of the era that we are still in, unfortunately, is, the average person has a vocabulary that includes a lot of words, right? Mutations, right? And tracking a virus and developing a therapeutic agent, broad-based, is obviously an essential part of this portfolio. Now, I would love to talk about what you need to do to get that broad-based antiviral. We talked about targeting the actual pathogen and targeting the host. It would seem like that holy grail lies within that immune response, the host immune response. My question is, as we jump into what's the opportunity here, scientifically and scalability-wise, what if we had an antiviral that targeted a family of viral structures? Is that something that's possible, or is it much better to go with looking at a host-focused therapeutic? Because it seems to me the host, locus of activity would be the ideal situation.
I mean, I'll say that first. I mean, I think the focus on the host makes sense in terms of having a broad spectrum antiviral activity, because many families of viruses use similar pathways. So you can get a broader spectrum activity if you target pathways that viruses use.
Yeah.
Obviously, by targeting host antiviral response, theoretically, you could have activity against any virus. So I think host-directed antivirals are the future in terms of broad spectrum activity generally.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, if you're going for a virus-specific activity, it's much more likely to be restricted in its activity.
And it's still a lot about timing. I mean, these infections, you need, unlike in some ways bacterial infections, you need to make sure we have the timing right, when to take this. You need to know you have a viral infection. Charles, again, your sense of the prospects of broad spectrum for the future.
Yeah, I think broad spectrum sort of approaches against these respiratory viruses, if it's something that can cover many respiratory viruses, could be easily administered in a timely way to really curb the infections at the local site, right? Nasal passages, the lungs, before it can wreak severe disease like pneumonias and resulting in hospitalization. Patients who get hospitalized, they still require antivirals, and some of these approaches would provide importance in boosting the immune response as your body is trying to fight these infections. And so I think, in the past and during COVID, what we've seen is people have used existing or pre-existing antivirals that was used for other viruses and to say, oh, let's see if SARS-CoV-2 can be affected by these drugs using these kind of drug combinations. And these are done by, to be honest, trial and error and see what happens.
Right.
Sort of happenstance.
Mhm.
And this is despite some of the knowledge that we have about the viral structures, but there's many different viral structures, very different types of viruses. It's very complicated, and to find a target that would cover all these respiratory viruses.
Yeah.
And so I think those studies need to be continued, right? But in addition, we need really to think outside the box and think about the host and really mobilize what our body has told us what's good to fight these infections. I think we've learned a lot from immunology, that these interferons are really antivirals. Why can't we mobilize them for some of our patients?
Right. We're using things. I mean, antivirals don't exist in nature the way antibiotics do, right? So these are all novel. These are kind of novel created therapeutics. And so the first place to go, obviously, are some of these existing therapeutics and try them again. And then, the next generation, Rick, is going to be more studies and looking at a host of different tactics.
Jeremy, we need all of the above.
Yeah.
We need all the above in our arsenal to be able to combat not only new viruses or pathogens that might emerge, but mutated versions of them as well. And the timing is critical. The speed is the name of the game here. So we need to have systems in place, trial networks ongoing, always, to be able to identify and characterize a new threat and see if there are existing drugs that can be repurposed very quickly and easily to work against that new pathogen. We need to develop therapeutics that target common mechanisms of replication or infection of different viruses as well. The challenge is sometimes with those that when you are targeting a replication process for a pathogen or that might be infected the cell, you might also impact the replication process for your own host cells. And so you have to be really careful with toxicity and a few other things when you're trying to really modify your host cell machinery towards a pathogen so it doesn't affect yourself as well. And we need these host-directed agnostic approaches that truly are modulating the immune response, either augmenting what your body is going to already do when it sees a novel pathogen, a foreign invader, or understanding what a virus might be doing to dysregulate that and replace that dysregulation, or really manage hyperactivation.
Right.
And we see that a lot in our bodies. When it sees a foreign substance, it turns on inflammation. You get the fever, you get the swelling, you get all this activity. And what that ends up doing sometimes is liquefying your lungs and you can't breathe, or turning them into a brick with ARDS. Late stage infection with COVID-19 leads to advanced respiratory distress, and your lungs actually turn into a brick and you can't breathe and everything shuts down, your organs shut down. We need to have the therapeutics that treat that and stop that before it gets to that stage. And we need to have some that actually work at that stage too. And so it really calls out for a full arsenal of therapeutics. And we haven't done such a great job in developing these in government.
Right.
Our focus, our investments in government, and when I was in BARDA, this was one of our key areas for national health security. And we tend to focus on that pathogen and pathogen-targeted therapeutics. It's only in the last couple of years, and probably driven mostly by what we're seeing with COVID, that the government is now starting to open the aperture and say, hey, we really do need to focus on these host-targeted agnostic therapeutics and having new programs. So we need to fund those. The funding has been woefully inadequate to address these new approaches for therapeutics. And we really do need to drive that process to make sure that we have funding for these new therapeutics and not just things that target the pathogen, as we watch now. We had more therapeutics available for COVID-19 6 months ago than we have today, a year ago than we had 6 months ago.
Yeah.
We did a lot, and then we rest on our laurels. We didn't keep up with the virus. It's changing, and now we're just watching those monoclonal antibodies just drop by the roadside, and we're back to 1 or 2 therapeutics. And so we're
potentially a more
ground here.
lethal virus could,
with very limited options to treat it, and the ones we have hanging on by a thread and extremely vulnerable because we don't have those therapeutics that are going to treat the host disease and make sure that we're giving the host every fighting chance it can to combat that virus, while we spend time probably trying to figure out another pathogen-targeted approach.
Right. So Phil, what does a small biotech need to move this forward? I mean, you're punching above your weight, yes, so like so many small biotechs, but you need an ecosystem that is focused on this. You need government support. You need to perhaps even leverage the modernization of clinical trials. Can you talk a little bit about what needs to happen to get these out there?
Well, a lot of things happened with COVID-19. I think the platform trials were a big success.
Yeah.
The recovery trial in the UK, the active trials in the US. But we need more of them. They need to be bigger. We need to push more therapies through them. And that's what we need access to as a small company.
Right.
As I mentioned earlier on, the clinical trials for these programs, they're large. We need the support of governments to run these trials, both in the outpatient setting and hospital setting.
The process for vaccine development is much different, but are there lessons to be learned with how we were able to pivot and act? Can we take some of that equity forward in other parts of this arsenal? And I'm thinking, the preprints and the sharing of the collaborative spirit we saw in early 2020. Is that something we could perhaps leverage to build up our...
I think I agree with some of Rick's comments earlier on. Actually, it's about the same focus that's been put into vaccines being put into antiviral treatments as well.
Yeah. Charles, I know you've been frustrated sometimes with government and listening to threats. What's your take on what needs to happen to really move this forward from an innovation standpoint?
Yeah, I think, what was mentioned about sort of the waning sort of interest in drug development with COVID-19 pandemic, and that's we're feeling it right now, right? That the options for therapies are limited now because of less options because of the viral variants have evolved, and I think we need to keep on continuing the previous efforts for viruses that are more seasonal, like influenza, RSV, and other viruses that we don't have therapies. It really required a concerted effort, like what Phil mentioned. With people who are interested in this area to promote more therapies for our patients and to have a network of collaborators and networks for patient recruitment and studies to really try different things for these different viruses. It'll be hard, but it really requires a lot of effort. That's why we're having this conversation, because it's not going to be where at the scale of COVID-19, right? Because everyone's effort was on that one virus. RSV, influenza, people take it for granted. But what's scary about those viruses is that each of us can be infected with it, but we don't know which of us will have the severe outcome, right? Yeah. And so we don't know. We can't predict. Certainly patients with lung diseases and elderly, they're more susceptible. But we've seen patients who have none of those above and still have bad outcomes. And so we take it really for granted that we might have the sniffles or the cold here and there. But we just don't know if you get that virus that has this exuberant immune response and bad outcomes in terms of ARDS. And so I think we need to continue our efforts. And people forget, prior to COVID, 80,000 people a year in the US dies of influenza. Right? That's a lot of people. Yeah. And so why do we take that for granted? Right. And so I think we need to really continue our discussion.
Is that an area of research, the predictability of who will have these reactions? I mean, it seems like a nascent area now, but when I think about so much of the hype around AI and putting these data points together, will we have a more cohesive picture of who ultimately is a real vulnerable population, aside from just your classic demographic, right? Kind of crude way of of identifying those patients. Will we be able to take advantage of some of these tools in the world of data in the next few years? My guess is yes. I mean, you're all nodding your heads.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. There are a lot of groups identifying biomarkers that are associated with more or less vulnerability.
Right.
Biomarkers are associated with more advanced disease and more severe disease. So we can actually validate those biomarkers and have a standardized test and assay. You might be able to predict who is more likely to advance to severe disease and bring the appropriate treatment on at the right stage and counteract that
Right.
progression.
Like we do with chronic disease susceptibilities. Right? Those efforts certainly
Like we do with
all about
sepsis, like we're trying to do with sepsis as well. I mean, it's a dysregulated process, but there are markers or breadcrumbs along the way.
Right.
We need to identify those and learn those, and then know how to interact and interfere with those steps along the way.
I think there's multiple places we can look at it as well. I mean, you can look at patients who've been infected and look in detail at their cellular response.
Right.
Also, you can look at genetics.
Sure.
I mean, certainly in our world of interferon with COVID, there was very strong evidence that interferon deficiency was playing a role.
Mm-hmm.
People who had polymorphisms in sort of interferon signaling pathways or interferon generation, people who had naturally occurring antibodies against other type 1 interferons, they were all more vulnerable to sort of severe disease. So I think we could use that kind of methodology to identify the patients who will benefit from particular treatments or to design new
Which
treatments.
guides more meaningful clinical trials, right?
Absolutely. You can select patients who are more likely to benefit in the same way that we focused on patients with respiratory disease because we demonstrated interferon beta deficiency in the lungs of those patients, which explains why they're more vulnerable to developing lower respiratory tract illness.
Well, speaking, I mean, the locus of activity, locus of infection, how important is the delivery mechanism? We talk about injectables, orals, intranasal delivery. Where does the future lie in this? In terms of that mechanism. Charles, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, we breathe air, and then with the air, sometimes that's how we get our viruses, right? So that's the first area of contact. And so a lot of efforts now are focusing on the nasal passages and respiratory tract, inhaled or nebulized treatments. And this allows actually easy access for patients who are at home that they can apply without having to intravenously. And so I think if this is effective and to be approached and target your respiratory tract immune responses and boosting the immune response to fight the viruses, the battle is sort of won there before going to the lungs. Right. And so I think there's a lot of promise and a lot of effort should be focused on that before patients show up in the hospital requiring IV formulations and things like that.
And that's critical for access. That's critical for equity. That's critical for global response as well. Mm-hmm. It's not everyone can get to the hospital. Look how many challenges we've had in this pandemic of getting people to a hospital or a unit to have an IV infusion of monoclonal antibodies. Mm-hmm. We need these treatments that will make it easier to access them, more available, more affordable, so more people who need the treatment and close those gaps and inequity.
Yeah. I was going to comment that obviously as an inhaled treatment, and we conducted a number of clinical trials in the home setting. In fact, the US government conducted a trial with our drug in the home setting where essentially the patient was given the nebulizer and the drug, took it home with them and took it at home unsupervised. They had a YouTube video to look at to show them how to use the device, and they were able to use it. These are patients who are not respiratory disease patients used to using inhalers. So it's definitely feasible.
Self-administered.
Yeah, self-administered at home. Yeah. I mean, in our own trial, we supervised patients over a video call, but again, they didn't struggle to use inhaled delivery.
Not just about the efficacy, it's about adherence. It's about reaching the people you need to reach, paired with the diagnostics so you know who needs this at what time. Again, something out of the crucible of despair over these years, I think, was the attention of how inequitable the world can be when it comes to simple things. And then you overlay that with the challenges of an injected virus, you have an adherence problem. You have it with just kids not wanting to go get their flu shot, or adults. So it does seem like that will address a much more larger range of therapeutic success if we get this right.
Yes. I mean, why can't we, start treating patients early at home and nursing homes before they progress, right? I think that's really the key. And so I think having these options is really important.
Yeah.
I'm a big advocate of a sick person should never have to leave the home to be diagnosed or treated. And you really want to keep them in the home. And you really want to make those drugs available as quickly as possible because they're going to be most effective the sooner they are used in an infection. And then it's important to have the right test to tell you the right drug at the right time. And it's important to have an arsenal of drugs that work at different stages. So that's very critical.
So will the medical world kind of keep pace with the social world? We're all so virtual. We have a virtual audience, many people. Do we see more attention to how we are going to tweak this ecosystem so that people can stay at home when they're sick, get the care they need? Again, telemedicine on steroids.
Yeah.
And will that be a bigger part of this arsenal? I think so.
Yeah.
But,
right?
But Jeremy, I think that's one of the lessons we've learned. One of the advantages of being in a public health emergency is a lot of those barriers and regulations that made it difficult for telehealth and for treatment across borders those walls have come down so we can do that and respond in the pandemic. Right. One of the concerns I have is as we consider lifting a public health emergency, a lot of those enabling activities and those relaxation of some of those barriers, those walls are going to go back up. So we have to learn those lessons and make sure that we don't, throw everything out that we've learned and go back to an old way of restricting access and restricting telehealth and telemedicine opportunity and treatment opportunities and diagnostic and testing opportunities across state lines in the U.S. and across our country. That's one of the lessons learned that I'm concerned of losing when we get to the stage of lifting a public health emergency.
We have short memories. We do. We have short memories. People rally around a cause when it is a timely cause. I'm thinking about, unfortunately, gun violence and other tragedies where you see a lot of activity and then, unfortunately, we forget. And so we need to keep our eye on the ball here, right? And all of these things have to keep moving forward for this larger ecosystem to change, for our vigilance to remain intact. Let's be more optimistic. Paint a picture 10 years from now. What does our therapeutic world look like? And what is the kind of a clinical setting look like in say hopefully 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think we're sort of getting there right now, right? Yeah. So we have a lot of data now. We have more diagnostic tools. We can identify these viruses easily now. The problem right now is we don't have enough therapeutics for these patients. And hopefully, I think in 10 years' time, we'll know what the virus is, when to treat them, what are the different types of treatments that can easily be accessible and used to stop the viruses, and then curb the infection really early on so that it prevents all these other systemic problems and long-term problems, readmission issues, hospitalization issues. And this will help everybody, not just patients with chronic diseases and stuff like that. So I think hopefully we learn more. For patients who do progress despite these early treatments, we have other types of treatments that can sort of curb their immune response and target those patients, and so that they end up less in the ICUs and die.
Yeah.
I agree. Certainly, I think diagnostic testing is going to change the way that we treat these viruses.
Right.
I think again we're all used to antigen testing for COVID, and you could imagine you could have a panel of those which tells you which treatment you should go and seek out, or a doctor could speak to you over a phone and send you the right treatment.
Yeah. And
also in the hospital setting, I think it's changed. What we're hearing from US physicians is that whereas before they wouldn't test for a panel of viruses, they might look for flu, they might look for RSV. It's becoming much more common practice now because the technology is available to look at the broad spectrum of virus as well. And hopefully what we'll have done in that time is develop more both virus-specific antivirals, but also host-directed antivirals to combat those different virus infections.
So it's diagnostic prowess gets much more robust.
Yeah.
Therapeutic arsenal gets much more substantial. And then you have the tools you need along with the vaccines and the vigilance and the public support. I mean, that's an ideal situation, right, Rick? Getting there is going to be tough.
Ideal. I think one of the most important players in that is the government partnership.
Yeah.
So the government needs to sustain their support. So I'm seeing the funding dry up from the government for pandemic support. We need to, as a government, continue to fund these large clinical trials, those multiple target clinical trials, so we can get these data. We need to also ensure there's a marketplace for these drugs. And so if there is no pull mechanism for these drugs as they're developed, then we can achieve regulatory success. But if there isn't a marketplace for them or some sort of way to stabilize a marketplace so they're used or held in reserve, so when they're needed, they're available, then these companies will still go out of business because there hasn't been an established marketplace. So we need to understand not only how to develop these quickly, but also how to use these, get them on the formularies in hospitals and change medical practice so they are using these. And I think our government needs to have a stockpile of these host-directed agnostic therapeutics, so we have them on hand when we need them. It's going to be much smarter to have these in a stockpile ready to go regardless, or giving you more opportunity to treat a greater variety of pathogens than it will be to have one or two pathogen-specific drugs that are outdated or may not work, and try to ramp up those in time. The better strategic solution is for our government to accelerate development of these host-targeted agnostic therapeutics and to stockpile them in a guaranteed marketplace so we have them when and where we need them for seasonal outbreaks and for a crisis when it occurs.
A long-term version of Operation Warp Speed, right? Kind of applied to this antiviral.
It's a long-term version of Operation Warp Speed, but also, really focusing in Operation Warp Speed on therapeutics, which we really need. But it's also a next generation project, BioShield.
Right.
Go back to national security. It transcends basic health security. And I apologize to anyone who's offended by that, but health security is critical. National security is critical as well.
Sure.
And the reason it's important to state that is because if you look at the budgets and funding for health and healthcare and our systems and new development of healthcare drugs and vaccines, it's a fraction of what we're investing in defense security. So we need to look at the budgets that we have for health and defense and realize that many of these things we're doing for health and health security are national security, biodefense issues, and we need to fund them adequately to accelerate the development. It shouldn't take 10 or 20 years to develop a drug after what we've learned with Operation Warp Speed. It's a high priority. People are dying. The patients are waiting. Let's get the job done.
Yeah, and there's also like a societal implication to the discussion of antivirals having more option is that what we haven't discussed is the overuse of antibiotics. And the reason for using these antibiotics is people don't have options for these viruses. And with this new diagnostic tools, right, we learn more and more that viruses can cause similar problems. And so that's a good thing. The bad thing is sometimes patients are requesting and asking for treatment, right, because they're sick. And the only options, unfortunately, are antibiotics that are misused and overused.
Yeah.
And this leads to antibiotic resistant problem, which is another major problem, which
particularly in other countries.
In other countries, right? And even in our country, right? So I think
in our own country.
Yes, exactly. And so I think this discussion about viruses versus bacteria, you talk about in 10 years' time, and hopefully we'll be more sophisticated about our approaches. Yeah. You have a virus, you have a bacteria, we'll give you the right therapies for that.
Yeah. Public information campaigns are important. I want to make sure we get some questions from our viewing audience, and my colleague in the back, Dan Ferber, will hopefully have some for our panel.
Absolutely. So here's a question from Andrew Thane of Lynx Medical. And the question is, we're talking about there's a triple-demic going on of COVID, RSV, and influenza. Remains a problem in many places. And in general about the drug, we're talking about drug development. What can be done to accelerate drug testing to ensure that new and safe and effective antivirals, including broad spectrum antivirals, are developed quickly?
I think we've covered it.
Some of that, but summarize.
I think we've covered it really in terms of it's having that governmental support and the platform trials running it and the infrastructure to test these drugs and to test them quickly.
It is. I mean, having each company, large or small, conduct their own studies, their own trials, looking for their own unique endpoints is very time consuming. It's very expensive. These platform trials, as long as they can be powered. I mean, we've conducted a number of platform trials in the United States in our active programs, and data has come out that's hard to interpret because the trials weren't large enough, or the population wasn't large enough, or it wasn't statistically powered. And it's left a lot of the companies sort of in limbo on how to best interpret some of those data because it was a platform trial, but it wasn't powered appropriately. So we really need to look at some lessons learned. Look at the Solidarity trial in the UK and some of these other models, learn from those, and design a platform trial that doesn't have just a generic, maybe irrelevant endpoint, but some endpoints that are powerful and the sample sizes that are statistically powered so we can accelerate and move these drugs forward instead of ending a trial and still sort of scratching our heads sometimes. We can do better.
Can we do better with non-competitive economizing the way we did years ago with what was the Transcelerate? More data sharing so that we don't have to waste so much time. I mean, it would seem to me there's more room to do this in different spheres. That's, I think, going to be a big key, right, Charles, to economizing the clinical trial process in general.
Yeah, I think so. I think we have to have the same definition, same recruitment, inclusion, exclusion criteria, same endpoints, similar approaches and infrastructure for recruitment in a diverse group of patient population. I think the outpatient is going to be very difficult because you're going to have a lot of patients that you require, right? And so it's a challenge, but that's what we need, right?
Yeah.
And so outpatient meaning that, when I treat patients when they're less sick, by the time they get to the hospital, it's harder to fix the problem, right? And so I think the efforts that has been learned from COVID, I think we could sort of replicate some of those efforts and for these kind of viruses.
When you talk about sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to make a comment about the other area that would be helpful in terms of pre-competitive space is to understand the clinical problem.
Yeah.
So if we do more work, understand the clinical problem, the patients who need the treatments most, some of the stuff we're talking about in terms of understanding the biology, why these patients are greater risk, what therapies they need, that will mean we develop the right drugs. The drugs got a greater chance of success. And you need large studies to do that, but you can share the information and everyone can mine that information for their own purposes. So I would definitely encourage that.
Will that hospital at home model also help? I mean, will that help clinical trials? Will we be doing more virtual trials? Will we need the legacy infrastructure right now of the clinical trials of the future as much?
Yeah, I think it's depends on the drug, right? Because I think a lot of them are monitored for safety, right? And then and at the same time looking for efficacy. And so I think some are more amenable for home deliveries.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And the stage of drug development as well. I mean, if you've got a newer drug, obviously you need to collect more safety information. You need to see the patients more often. But if you have a drug with an established safety profile, I think. Right.
But I love that vision.
I love that
vision. And because we can monitor people remotely. I mean, somebody buys sensors you can put on, you can monitor for things. You don't have to and keep them in the hospital and things. If you can put them back in the home, actually you might see better, more impactful outcomes from the therapies because they're at home instead of in the hospital or in some treatment centers. So, I mean, that's the vision. It's not appropriate. It's not one size fits all. But we should find ways to incorporate more data, more people from these more innovative, modern models. But
it definitely will work. I mean, as I say, we did it in our phase 2 trial in COVID in the home setting. That was all video calls with the patients. There's no face-to-face interaction at any point with the healthcare profession. It was all done remotely and they were recruited via our website. So, and that worked very well.
And you get some early human use data as well to understand how difficult it might be, how the instructions are. So you're gaining that knowledge earlier in the stage of development, which is informing your late stage development, which is saving time and cost off the development of that therapeutic.
Yeah, and there are some trials I know during COVID where they actually have mobile units to actually go to patients' home to get the blood draws and samples and testing. And so that makes it more accessible for patients who are participating in these kind of trials. And so I think we have to be innovative that way.
And it happens in stages. I mean, I remember sitting at a health conference 10 years ago and everyone thought in a decade, it's going to be in silico trials. And, Major transformational disruption was imagined, but it doesn't happen overnight. Very rarely does it happen overnight. So the idea is, if this evolves into a more equitable, more easier process, we can hopefully gain more from it, right?
Yeah, I think what we learned from COVID is such a large scale that all the efforts was paid attention to this one virus.
Right.
And despite that, in current pandemic, there's already waning of interest, right? And that's actually kind of scary, right? RSV is not at the same scale, but it's still a major problem. And so we really have to focus in a clever way to continue these efforts, but still able to do those kind of work that we did for COVID.
Right.
But Jeremy, you're bringing in the word equitable process. So you have to think of equity. I mean, one of the things that's been really revealed in this outbreak is how inequitable our response is, how inequitable access to drugs and vaccines and diagnostics has been. And also that challenges developing new drugs and vaccines if you don't have full representation in the clinical trials. And if you're not able to connect those clinical trials in more places and get a broader representation of different backgrounds and populations, then it can also slow down the development of that drug.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think any event in recent history has cast in such stark relief the medical haves and the medical have-nots.
Right.
And I think that's something that we will hopefully not forget. And that will infuse every health policy, every investment as we try for a healthier global population.
Yeah. Jeremy, it has to be intentional.
Yeah.
It has to be intentional. At every company, in every trial, there has to be that intentional effort to be inclusive, equitable, and representative. Otherwise, it's too easy, I think, to default back. And it limits the information we get, and it limits the breadth of the population that the treatment can be effective in.
Yeah. Dan, is there another question from our
sort of follow up on drug development? Has the success of COVID antiviral medicines caused drug companies working on novel antivirals to stop their work due to the difficulty of gaining market for their product? And do you know of specific examples?
Kind of an industry question, but a broad-based question. Phil, I'll look to you to chime in.
I think it's still a huge unmet medical need. I mean, I think we heard earlier on about how the monoclonal antibody therapies are dropping away one by one. We still need more drugs for COVID, and there are plenty of other viruses out there. We don't have any treatments at all yet.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about a lot of the other viruses. Rhinoviruses, human metapneumovirus, parainfluenza viruses. The list goes on, and we don't have treatments for those. So there's still many opportunities to develop drugs.
There's no debate that this is an unmet medical need. There's no debate that this is a market.
No, and again, we talked about it earlier on. I think even before COVID, hundreds of thousands of people in the US were ending up in hospital every year with respiratory viruses, and it became the norm. And I think we've got a chance now with the pandemic to think about this again and work out how we develop treatments for those patients who need these drugs every year.
Right.
But Jeremy, we're hearing this already, that a number of companies with promising developments are turning away from their development efforts because of the prospect of a waning marketplace for therapeutics for COVID. And so you have to be able to transcend COVID. And we also know the examples of antibiotics in the antibiotic marketplace. It's a failed marketplace where companies are spending a lot of money, and governments too, in public-private partnerships, spending billions of dollars developing a new drug. And if there isn't that marketplace at the end of that development, if there isn't an expedited process of getting a new drug on a hospital formulary, if there isn't the work ahead on reimbursement and Medicare and Medicaid and those, and getting the DRG codes and others and NTAPs and all these unique things that are helpful to small companies with new drugs, then the company can spend all these years and money developing a great drug and getting it approved by the FDA, and then spend years trying to get those other processes figured out. In the meantime, they can go bankrupt. We've seen that in the antibiotic marketplace time and time and time again. And we need to learn from that lesson as we develop these new powerful therapeutics for respiratory viruses and other things, that the homework needs to be done for integration of those new therapeutics into our healthcare system, into our practice, into our reimbursement models, so the marketplace to sustain that company and to re-inject funds into additional innovation. Because when you lose those companies, you lose that mindset, you lose that workforce, you lose that innovation, and the whole system suffers. So we have to learn that lesson from the antibiotic marketplace, make sure that doesn't happen again in the therapeutic for respiratory virus, and another major government issue that we need to solve.
Well, you've underscored a huge other lesson. Okay, so there's the inequity, but also the role of industry, right? To champion innovation, to scale innovation. Government can't do it alone. The public sector can't do it alone. NGOs can't do it alone. This is a complex as it is. When working right, a well-balanced ecosystem that eventually, hopefully under the right conditions, ideally gets products to where they need to go, right? And that's the inquisitive minds of these amazing scientists working for sometimes not a lot of money. It's for, governments to champion this and to prioritize need. We can work together, right? It's messy. It doesn't always work out well, and we learn from our mistakes. But I think that is, for me, I guess, one of the biggest lessons, the role of industry. And industry certainly, benefited by people saying, oh, you know what? These guys do a lot. These people do a lot, right? So we can't lose that, right? I'm not looking at you because you're in industry.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you.
Do we have time for another question, Dan, or how are we doing on time?
We can do it. One more.
Can we get one more question in?
Yeah. So the question is, talked a lot about the need for new large scale trials and just different ways of getting the drugs through the pipeline. New drugs through the pipeline. How easy is it to set up a new trial and funding in the current economic climate?
That's a very good question. Economic climates change and they pivot just as much as infectious disease priorities. So how easy is this to do? Now I'm looking at you because I know you want to do more clinical trials.
Well, at the moment, the climate is clearly challenging, isn't it? I mean, that's self-evident. But you have to make the case based on the clinical need. And I think, again, here, having a broad spectrum antiviral product is an easier play. But it's definitely challenging at the moment. And again, this is where I think government involvement and a long-term vision would be very helpful.
Yeah,
I think partnership, with government and industry and academics. And I think the patients are wanting this, right? When they get sick, I think they want to be treated. And I think we cannot sort of forget what we learned from COVID-19, right? We're in the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't have a lot of oral options, right? We would just tell patients, stay home, don't come to the emergency room. And so that's because we didn't have any options. And I think over time, we have new developments. And so I think we have to keep on adding it. And these are not trivial problems. Patients die from flu and RSV. So
clinical trials.
I think it's getting harder all the time, honestly. And I lived the scars of 20 years of developing drugs for influenza, and understanding the complexities of, especially trying to develop drugs for hospitalized patients and getting enough patients, and then needing to expand to international trial sites and to manage the coordination of so many different areas of different standard of practice, standard of care, and others. So it's very complex. And I feel like so much investment has gone into the COVID response that a lot of investors are getting wary and trying to see where they should turn their investment areas into other areas, not necessarily on additional large clinical trials. But we need to remind the investors and the public partners as well, and not just the United States government, but international organizations need to step up to the plate to support these trials for global preparedness. But we need to remind them of this unmet need, and we need to remind them of the progress that's been made. So it's not like we're starting from scratch. We have momentum. We have progress. We need to build on that and get the drugs developed so they can be available. If we let up now, then the progress will be lost. And it's always harder to start again
Yeah.
It's easier to start from scratch than to start again because you've lost that momentum. You've lost the brain power. You've lost that advocacy group or whatever it might be. So now is the time not to let up on our pandemic efforts, but to double down, bring in investments, get this job done, and make sure that's the only way we'll be better prepared next time. And the next time, Jeremy, is coming very soon.
I don't doubt that. And I know that represented here is the wherewithal of human ingenuity that will hopefully protect us from the next time and the next time. But I think this was a great forum. And I want to thank all of you gentlemen, Phil, Charles, Rick, for participating. A lot to think about, a lot to, the power of innovation. Like you say, Rick, we need to remind people what this can do. And I think back to many years ago when people doubted James Allison and Carl June with immunotherapy. Ask the person who was dying of cancer, right? One of those first 12 people that is living today cancer-free, ask them what they think about, the investment in immunotherapy. And right, ask someone in 1922 who had diabetes, a death sentence after insulin.
Right.
And we see this so many times in retro, right? Looking in the mirror. The rear view mirror. We have to look forward and make sure people don't forget what the power of innovation can do for us as a globe. That's all for today. Thank you, viewers, here in this wonderful room at the National Press Club and online. We thank you for the attention and hope you've gained something out of this amazing discussion. Bye-bye and good morning, everyone.